Good evening. Thank you for joining us. You are our biggest draw yet.
Okay.
I knew putting your name out there on the sign would help. Tonight we have with us Jack Hudson. He's going to talk about his time as a test pilot, A10, and that's it. Makes my life easier.
Splendid job,
There you
Kathy.
go. Short and sweet.
It's not a whole bunch to tell you,
Yeah.
because that was too short.
Oh,
Okay, so,
I forgot one thing. Don't wait for Q&A time. Ask him as he goes on.
Okay.
There you go.
yeah, okay, I was going to emphasize that anyway. So, hey, if you have questions as we go along, just sing out, okay? That way you don't have to wait till the end and maybe forget what you were going to ask, or
That'd be me.
we bypass it. So as we go along, please ask away. So I've got some charts here, and some of these are photographs, some of them are word charts. Well, I'll spend more time on the photographs. I think they're more fun to look at anyway. So by background, I came out of the academy in 1973. I had a year of graduate school at Purdue. I got a master's in aeronautics and astronautics, and then off to pilot training. My first pilot training assignment, I was a T-38 instructor. So if you go over to the Air Force Museum and go into the third building, and as you come into the third building and turn left and head down toward the A-10, there's a T-38 there. So I spent 3 years teaching student pilots how to fly the T-38, which is the advanced trainer used in the second half of pilot training. So then, toward the end of that, we had to fill out dream sheets for, okay, what do we want to do next? And so I put my list together and submitted it. I had the A10 at the top, and I got assigned to the A10. So I went through training, went over to Bentwaters, England for 3 years, flying the A10. So prime time Cold War, late 70s, early 80s. And one thing I'd wanted to do in the Air Force was go to the test pilot school. So I applied for it, got in, and started in January of 1982. Graduated in December of 1982. And then I was assigned to the A10 Test Force. So in my test pilot school class, there were 2 of us that came out of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing in Bentwaters, England. And so we were the first 2 pilots to go to the test pilot school that had operational A10 time. Well, I got assigned to the A10 Test Force at Edwards. The other guy went down to Eglin in Florida to do weapons testing. So that's the 2-seat A10 up there. There was only one of them built, and it was actually a modification of a single-seater that was produced. So the Air Force had a contract with Fairchild Republic to build the A10, to develop it and build it. And there were about 700 built altogether. And so the very first production airplane was that one, modified to the 2-seat configuration. So the idea for the test program for the 2-seater was to see if a 2-seater being flown by just the pilot in front, because the pilot in the back functioned as the safety observer. Because this airplane flew around at night at low level. I have about 150 hours in this airplane, this particular airplane. I have about 1,200 hours A10 time altogether. And so the idea was to test this airplane to see if it could function at low level with the single pilot doing the night attack mission. And so we could go down to as little as 200 feet over flat terrain in the pitch black. Wow. And there's not a lot of room there. You know, you have to be careful. And I'll show you as we go through this how we did all this. But the idea was to find out if one person could fly that kind of the A10 mission at night using some special equipment. The pilot in the back was a safety observer. So I did some missions as a safety observer also. And the safety observer was there to keep an eye on things, to make sure that the altitude minimums didn't get broken, because it wouldn't take much to break them. And then fly into terrain. So that, the primary job was to keep things safe at night, yes.
So if you were getting too low, what did that person do?
Pull back on the stick.
So they had control.
That is not gonna work.
Okay.
But basically, you'd say, watch your altitude.
Okay.
You know, or you're turning too tight, because you had to be careful of bank angle
Okay.
also. We had a 30-degree bank angle limit. Now, during the day, you did whatever you had to do. I mean, I spent a lot of time upside down and pulling a lot of G's in the A10 in the daytime, because the regular A10 only flew its mission in the daytime.
So was it dual controls?
Yes, everything was dual control, yep.
So the backseater had an interest in you not running into things.
Exactly.
So-
Yeah, because whatever happened to the front seater, the back seater would be a microsecond behind. Yeah, so that's how, that's kind of the fundamentals of the program. And so, a lot of people think that that two-seater was being tested as a trainer. Now, the Air Force never had a project to test it as a trainer. Fairchild Republic, I know, was hoping that the Air Force would pick up some two-seaters to use as trainers. Because when I went through training in the A-10, first flight I had in the airplane, I was on my own, because there were no two-seat trainers. We didn't even have any simulators at the time.
Wow.
We had just a wooden cockpit mock-up, and that's where we did our emergency procedures check, was in this wooden mock-up. But the airplanes all fly the same way. You know, you have to learn all the switches and gauges, and the harder things are to, okay, how do you start the engines, and how do you get things set up to actually go fly? And when you pull the stick back, the airplane goes up, and you know, they all work the same fundamentally, and then you have to learn how to drop bombs and shoot the gun. But Fairchild Republic hoped that there would be some interest in a two-seat trainer. There never was by the Air Force. And so, anyway, so we'll talk about this. Let's go to the next chart. Wait a minute, I'll do that. I'll do that. I don't have somebody. Okay, let's try this. There we go. Those are the patches from the program. So on the left, that's the A10 test team patch. Now, remember, the primary mission of the basic A10 was to kill tanks. So therefore, the hatchet there, you know, smashing the tank. And then on the right, SSNA is single seat night attack. So you got an owl there. And so the symbology was that's the program, single seat night attack program. So those are the patches that we had. The picture there, I actually took that picture from a single seat A10. That's Mount Hood in the background. That's in Washington. See, okay, wait a minute. The testing was done down at Edwards. Well, we actually got permission to take the two-seater and a single-seater up to McCord Air Force Base, up towards Seattle, and fly it around in the state of Washington for 3 weeks at night. Because the terrain's fundamentally different. You got mountainous terrain around there. So over mountainous terrain, we had a 500-foot altitude restriction rather than 200 feet over flatland. But we took the airplane up there and flew it for 3 weeks. We actually did some flying on the Army base there, and worked with some forward air controllers at night. And there were different levels of humidity up there in the state of Washington as compared to Edwards, which is dry almost all the time. So we saw some interesting things in terms of the weather and the terrain and the airplane and how it all works. So it was a really good TDY, and 3 weeks up there, but everything went well. So when we got ready to bring the two airplanes back, we climbed. It was a cloudy day. We climbed up, popped through the clouds. I had a 35mm camera with me, and the pilot in the front seat of the other airplane was my boss, and I said, hey, just kind of hold your climb rate where you are. And I backed off a little bit. There was one of our engineers in the back seat, and I took several pictures, and that's one of them right there. So it came out really, really well. It was just a most beautiful sight to pop through the clouds, and there's Mount Hood in the background. Totally unplanned.
Question.
Yeah.
What, you mentioned the humidity, what difference does that make with the plane?
Well, that's a great question. To fly around at night, and I have pictures of this coming up. We carried a pod underneath the airplane, a forward-looking infrared pod. Because in the daytime, you just look outside to see where you're going. Assuming it's reasonably clear outside. If you're in for airplanes that have radars, A10 doesn't have a radar, but let's say you were flying an F-111 at night, you'd have a radar looking out, and you could follow, train following radar commands. The forward-looking infrared would look outside, and you could look at the imagery displayed on a big head-up display, and there was a repeater for this in the back that the safety observer in the back could see the infrared imagery. Well, the infrared imagery was a perfect one-to-one correspondence with the outside scene. So you could look at this infrared imagery, and you could fly what's called white hot, which means that hot surfaces show up as white and cold as black, or you could reverse that. I always flew white hot. It just seemed more realistic to do it that way. But you could see pretty well, actually, because things would tend to, certain things would retain the heat longer than others. So you could pick out terrain features and ground vehicles. You could see them really well at night. So we did a lot of simulated attack work on ground vehicles. I think it was Fort Irwin up there. No, it wasn't Fort Irwin. Fort Lewis was up by Seattle. Fort Lewis, and we did some other work too. You could see these vehicles at night really well with the infrared because they'd retain heat. Now, we found in the higher humidity up there that infrared, in some cases, you couldn't see through the high humidity. It was hard to do that. It would be like blocked. Like if there were rain showers or if it was imminent to rain, you could tell that with the infrared. So it was a little more complicated to fly around in the higher humidity conditions. Ideally, for doing that night work, the drier the better.
Yeah.
So that was one of the things we saw up there, along with having to be extra super careful with the mountainous terrain and trees and all
Was
that.
that lantern pop?
It was a precursor to it. It was a precursor to it. Lantern, all the work that we did here fed into the development of night capability that we have today, including lantern systems. Yeah, it all fed into this. You could look at what we had as kind of a kludged up early version of that. Okay, now, this wasn't the only test project going on at the time. We had some follow-on gun testing that was still being done. Because this is 1982. The airplane reached the initial operational capability in 1976 at Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. So we were still doing some gun testing. I did some ground proximity warning system testing with some preliminary systems for the A10. And we'd go out there, this is at Edwards, and dive down at certain angles and certain altitudes and test to see if the system would provide warnings to the pilot when it was supposed to. So that was ground proximity warning system. I also flew some missions where we had what was called have bounce testing. Have bounce was a program that looked at how airplanes could land and whether it would be okay to land on runways that had crude repairs after they'd been bombed. So you had to, okay, suppose there's a big bump in the runway here, you'd have to land and touch down at a certain sync rate and a certain distance in front of the bump, and then we had sensors on the airplane that would measure the response of the airplane as you go through these bumps. And the bumps were of different heights and types. So that was also going on. So those were the three big programs in addition to this night attack program that were ongoing. So these are all the people that were on board. Anybody here know General Odgers, Pete Odgers? Ever met him? Did you meet him? Did you know him well?
No, just Pentagon duty, Joe.
Yeah, he was just a wonderful guy. He's passed away now, but
He was amazing.
he was the test center commander. He was the one that let us take the two-seater and a single-seater up to Tacoma for 3 weeks. He did come up to check on us once. He flew an A-7 up there, and you know, we briefed him on everything that was going on, and he was such a great commander, though. I mean, he took a hard look at everything we wanted to do and said, okay, and then came up and checked on us, and I gave him a lot of credit for that. He let us go do that, and you know, trusted us to take care of business and be safe, and it all worked. And then we had Fairchild support for the airplane. Fairchild really maintained the two-seater as opposed to a blue suit maintenance, Air Force maintenance.
Was that the last fighter Fairchild made, A-10? I think it was, wasn't it? Or they produced something after?
It would have been the last
I
one.
think it was the last one before they got bought.
Well, there was the 105, P-47.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know what else was in there, but the A-10 would have been last.
T-30, no, Northrop did the T-30.
Yeah, Northrop was T-30.
I think A-10 was the last one.
Yep,
Right.
yep. That was the four of us there. I'm on the left. The commander of the test center is kind of in the middle, closest to the camera. The guy on the right is the colonel that was in the, he was the wing DO. It was Colonel Dick Cooper. He'd come down and fly the single-seater. He flew a few sorties in the two-seater as a safety observer. But he was kind of the front office rep to the program. And this was taken at dusk one night with the two-seater in the background. That's me on the left side over in England. My dad took that in either September or October of 1980. And then that's on the right there. That same in 1982, or 1983 rather. So the single-seater, we kind of talked about that just a little bit, but you can see the kind of things that the single-seater would carry. ECM pods, there's a Maverick missile on this one, the paved penny pod, which is just below the cockpit, the little pod sticking down. And
Any special story about the name Warthog?
there, you know, I don't know where it came from actually. It's, I think, similar origin to like people come up with names for the airplanes.
Yeah.
Are different from the official names,
Mhm.
and these made-up names stick.
Just wonder if there was some unusual story about it. So
I think it has to do with the general ugliness of the appearance of the airplane. I think that's kind of where it came from,
that fits.
and it's accurate.
Hmm.
What do you think about them taking them out of service?
Well, so the Air Force has tried for quite a while to retire the A-10s.
Yeah, I know they have, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, well, but the reason is that the Air Force wants to be able to take, it's probably more to do with personnel than anything else, because the maintainers, and all the support that goes to the airplane, they want to be able to reallocate to the F-35 and other things.
Yeah, taking its place, which is.
Yeah,
sounds
and there's
like-
money involved too, you know, I mean, there's about, at the start of this fiscal year, there were about 280 A-10s still in service between the active duty, the Guard, and the Reserve. The others, you know, we've lost some due to accidents, we've lost a few in combat.
That's the one, the guy drilled one into the mountain in Colorado.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that one, yeah. So of the 700 that were originally built, some due to accidents,
Didn't realize there were many.
kind of a small number lost in combat operations, and then the rest have been retired. No other countries fly the A-10. So the Air Force had tried a number of times to get Congress to approve retirements. Congress did approve this fiscal year, which ends on the 30th of September, to retire 21 A-10s. And one thing the Air Force wanted to do was retire about twice that many from Tucson, but move the like the fighter weapons school from Nellis down to Tucson and move some other operations into Tucson. They haven't been able to do that yet because the